Johnny Carson spent 3 decades as the king of late-night television, bringing America's biggest celebrities into homes nationwide with his signature wit and seemingly natural interviewing ability. From behind his NBC desk, he created something special, a show where stars dropped their carefully constructed personas and showed audiences something closer to their true selves. But sometimes, that authenticity revealed things nobody wanted to see. Throughout Carson's 30-year run, attitudes about race in America shifted dramatically. The relaxed, long-form nature of The Tonight Show occasionally exposed prejudices that other, more controlled TV appearances managed to conceal. What resulted was an uncomfortable historical archive of casual racism from some of America's most cherished entertainers. Moments many fans would rather forget. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of classic Hollywood, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into television history you won't find anywhere else. A former NBC executive who collaborated with The Tonight Show during the 70s and 80s explained the challenge Carson faced. He was welcoming established legends who'd risen to fame when racist jokes and attitudes were just part of how entertainment worked. Simultaneously, he was trying to navigate an America where those same attitudes were increasingly seen as harmful and wrong. This created complicated situations on air. Carson's own views on race were generally ahead of their time, though still imperfect by today's measures. He had to manage guests whose perspectives ranged from quietly prejudiced to openly bigoted. Television historian Margaret Collins put it plainly. Carson couldn't just refuse to book every star with problematic racial views. That would have meant eliminating half of Hollywood's major names throughout the 60s and 70s. But when you watch the archived footage carefully, you can see him growing more uncomfortable with certain guests as time went on, making small but meaningful changes in how he conducted their segments. Today, we're examining 7 of Johnny Carson's most racially troubling guests, entertainment icons whose Tonight Show appearances revealed prejudices that clash sharply with their polished public images. These moments illuminate how America's comprehension of racism evolved during television's golden age, proving that even the nation's most beloved personalities weren't exempt from the biases of their times. America's cowboy, John Wayne. No one symbolized American mythology quite like John Wayne, the tough individualist whose films championed frontier justice, uncomplicated manhood, and steadfast patriotism. For decades, Wayne was one of Hollywood's most profitable stars, embodying a specific vision of American identity that millions embraced. His Tonight Show visits usually celebrated this polished image, with Carson showing the reverence expected for a living legend. Yet beneath Wayne's iconic screen image lay political and racial convictions that contradicted the inclusive America gradually taking shape during Carson's era. These views exploded into public consciousness through an infamous 1971 Playboy interview where Wayne expressed opinions that went far beyond conservative politics into explicitly racist territory. Entertainment journalist Thomas Henderson noted Wayne's most notorious statement from that interview, where he declared his belief in white supremacy until black people were educated to a point of responsibility. This wasn't something ambiguous or easily misunderstood. It was a clear endorsement of white supremacy from one of America's most treasured cultural figures. The interview contained numerous other disturbing statements, including Wayne defending European colonizers taking land from Native Americans, claiming there were great numbers of people needing new land while Indians selfishly tried to keep it for themselves. He also dismissed the existence of systemic racism in Hollywood. Carson interviewed Wayne multiple times, both before and after the Playboy interview became public knowledge. The fascinating question isn't merely what Wayne believed, but how Carson handled interviewing someone whose racist views had become public record. The comedy legend, Bob Hope. Bob Hope represented the establishment of American comedy during his Tonight Show appearances, a living connection to vaudeville, early radio, and the USO shows that had made him beloved across multiple generations. His patriotic credentials and tireless performances for American troops had earned him a special place in American entertainment, largely insulating him from criticism of the racist content that had characterized much of his early career. Entertainment historian Robert Thompson noted Hope's long history of racist jokes, blackface performances, and Chinese accents during his early years. Hope came up when these forms of humor were standard in American entertainment. Like many comics of his generation, he built parts of his early career on racist caricatures and stereotypes that would be completely unacceptable by modern standards. Unlike some performers who acknowledged the problematic nature of their early material as social attitudes evolved, Hope maintained a notably resistant stance toward changing standards of racial sensitivity in comedy. When questioned about his use of racist stereotypes, he typically dismissed concerns rather than acknowledging their harmful impact. He refused to apologize for past routines and defended them as being of their time. This response reflected a common attitude among entertainers of Hope's generation, the belief that evolving standards represented unnecessary political correctness, rather than legitimate concerns about the harmful effects of racial stereotyping.
The Hollywood Conservative, Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston occupied a unique position in American culture during his Tonight Show appearances. A Hollywood star whose career spanned biblical epics like The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, to science fiction classics like Planet of the Apes and Soylent Green, his commanding presence and distinctive voice had made him one of cinema's most recognizable figures. His increasingly outspoken conservative politics set him apart in a liberal-dominated industry, and these politics took on more controversial dimensions in his later years, particularly regarding race. As Heston became more politically active, especially through his leadership of the National Rifle Association, his public statements increasingly reflected perspectives that many critics viewed as dismissive of civil rights concerns and systemic racism in America. Political analyst Jennifer Washington noted that Heston became president of the NRA and in later years made statements dismissing systemic racism. Heston frequently characterized civil rights activists as complainers and suggested racism was primarily a problem of the past rather than an ongoing systemic issue. These perspectives became increasingly central to his public persona during the later years of Carson's tenure. The insult comic, Don Rickles. Don Rickles represented a unique challenge for Johnny Carson regarding racial sensitivity, a comedian whose entire persona was built around insult humor that frequently targeted racial and ethnic identities. Known as Mr. Warmth, an ironic nickname given his caustic style, Rickles had developed a comedy approach that violated virtually every principle of racial sensitivity, yet had somehow established a unique cultural position where many viewed his most offensive material as somehow exempt from normal standards. Comedy historian Michael Barnes noted that Rickles was a legendary insult comic, but many routines targeted Black, Asian, and Jewish guests. His entire approach was built around abrasive boundary-crossing insults. While he targeted everyone, regardless of background, his material frequently relied on racial and ethnic stereotypes that would have been considered clearly offensive coming from almost any other performer. Rickles' racial material wasn't subtle or ambiguous. It directly employed slurs and stereotypes in ways that would have immediately ended most careers. His comedy pushed well beyond the boundaries of what other performers could get away with, even in the more permissive atmosphere of earlier decades. Barnes pointed to one particularly egregious example. Rickles called Sammy Davis Jr. a spear chucker on stage. This wasn't isolated or accidental. Rickles routinely used explicit slurs and racial caricatures throughout his career. What made his case unique was the strange permission he seemed to have from many of the very communities he targeted, including performers like Sammy Davis Jr., who maintained friendship with Rickles despite being the target of his most offensive material. Carson's personal and professional relationship with Rickles added another layer of complexity to his Tonight Show appearances. Unlike some problematic guests from whom Carson maintained professional distance, the charming rogue, Bert Reynolds.
Bert Reynolds embodied a particular vision of roguish Southern masculinity during his peak fame in the 70s and early 80s, the charismatic good old boy whose mischievous smile and easygoing charm made him one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. His frequent Tonight Show appearances highlighted this charm, with Carson clearly enjoying Reynolds' self-deprecating humor and entertaining anecdotes. Behind this appealing persona, however, occasionally emerged racial attitudes reflecting his Southern upbringing during the Jim Crow era. Entertainment journalist Rebecca Santos noted that Reynolds was known for cowboy charm, but made several racially charged jokes in the 70s and early 80s. Reynolds had grown up in Florida during segregation, and while he was more progressive than many Southern men of his generation, his humor occasionally revealed lingering racial attitudes that became increasingly problematic as social awareness evolved during his career. Unlike some of Carson's more consistently problematic guests, Reynolds's racial insensitivity typically emerged as isolated incidents rather than persistent patterns. Momentary lapses that contrasted with his generally more inclusive public persona. These incidents were nonetheless significant, particularly when they occurred on a platform with the reach and influence of The Tonight Show. Santos continued, "One segment about Native Americans drew hundreds of complaints. During a 1978 appearance, Reynolds made several jokes about Native Americans that relied on stereotypes and dismissive attitudes toward their concerns. The segment generated an unusual volume of viewer complaints at a time when such feedback required writing physical letters rather than posting on social media."
The comedy veteran, Red Skelton. Red Skelton represented an earlier era of American comedy when he appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, a direct link to vaudeville, radio, and the early days of television comedy. His legendary status and contributions to multiple entertainment forms had earned him widespread respect, including from Carson himself, who had grown up watching Skelton's performances and clearly viewed him as a foundational figure in American comedy. This respect, however, created challenges as Carson attempted to navigate the significant gap between the racial sensibilities of Skelton's formative era and the evolving standards of later decades. Skelton had begun his career at a time when blackface and racial caricature were standard elements of mainstream American entertainment, practices he had participated in throughout his early years. Entertainment historian Robert Thompson noted that Skelton was a comedic legend with a blackface history. Like many performers of his generation, Skelton had routinely employed blackface and racial caricatures in his early career. These weren't occasional lapses, but standard elements of entertainment during the era when he developed his approach to comedy. Unlike some performers who acknowledged the problematic nature of such material as social awareness evolved, Skelton maintained a notably defensive stance toward changing standards of racial sensitivity in comedy. When questioned about his past performances or asked to reflect on the changing understanding of racist entertainment, he typically resisted acknowledging any legitimate concerns. Thompson continued, "He defended minstrel humor well into the 1980s. The unapologetic throwback, Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett represented a particular challenge among Johnny Carson's regular guests, a comedian whose approach remained firmly rooted in an earlier era of American entertainment despite the evolving standards around him. Known for his rubbery face, distinctive voice, and willingness to push boundaries with risque material, Hackett had built a successful career through nightclub performances, film roles, and television appearances. Throughout these varied contexts, racial humor remained a consistent element of his comedic approach. Comedy historian Michael Barnes noted that Hackett frequently told racist jokes on and off air. Unlike some performers who moderated their material as social standards evolved, Hackett maintained essentially the same approach throughout his career, an approach that included racial stereotypes, ethnic accents, and jokes targeting various minority groups on The Tonight Show.
This created increasingly awkward situations as American awareness of racial sensitivity developed during Carson's tenure. What distinguished Hackett from some of Carson's other problematic guests was the deliberate, almost defiant nature of his continued reliance on racial material. While some performers inadvertently revealed dated attitudes or occasionally lapsed into problematic territory, Hackett actively embraced racial humor as a central aspect of his comedic identity, resisting pressure to update his approach even as standards around him changed significantly. Barnes continued, "He had a reputation among comics as the guy who never stopped telling World War II-era slurs." Within the comedy community, Hackett became known for his unwillingness to evolve beyond the racial humor that had been standard during his formative years. While many comedians of his generation gradually adapted their material to reflect changing sensibilities, Hackett maintained an approach that younger comedians increasingly viewed as inappropriate and harmful.